few weeks ago, I found myself in a conversation that, well, felt more like an interrogation. The topic was Iran. And, for most people in the room, it was just a headline. But for me, it's my father's history. It is my family's DNA. Everyone there was leaning in, faces flushed with that kind of total certainty you only get from a 30-second news clip. They were ready to march, ready to condemn, and they were looking at me to provide the correct soundbite. One woman leaned over her drink, her eyes narrowed with a sort of moral hunger, and she asked, "It's simple, isn't it? You just have to pick a side." She expected a yes or a no. She expected me to flatten my entire complicated identity into a team jersey. But as I sat there, I realized something really uncomfortable. For her, this was a political spectacle. For me, it was a landscape of unresolved fractures and exile. And when I didn't give her the immediate loud allegiance she wanted, the atmosphere in the room just sneezed it instantly. The curiosity vanished, replaced by this cold, suspicious silence. It was as if by refusing to join the binary, I had somehow become the enemy. And it made me think about this strategy of tension we're all living through. This system that profits from compressing our complexity until there's nothing left but tribalism. We've been trained to confuse belonging with belief, and we've been told that taking a moment to actually think is a form of indecision. But what if staying nuanced is actually a quiet form of resistance? Why are we so terrified of the person who refuses to be swept up by the crowd? And what happens to us when we finally decide to stop outsourcing our values to the loudest voice in the room?
That experience you're describing, that sudden chilling shift from, just social curiosity to actual suspicion, that's one of the most pervasive symptoms of the era we are all living in.
It felt so personal.
Oh, it always does when it happens across the dinner table. But what's so crucial to understand is that this isn't just about social dynamics or bad manners. That demand for a binary response, that hunger for you to pick a jersey.
Yeah, the jersey.
That's the result of a massive structural mechanism that has been running in the background of our societies for decades now.
It really felt mechanical. Almost like there was a script I was supposed to follow, and because I went off script, I broke the machine.
In a way, you did. You absolutely did. You disrupted a feedback loop. And today, we're going to look at exactly why that middle ground, that space where you were trying to stand, the space where actual thinking happens, is being systematically dismantled.
It's not just disappearing, it's being actively dismantled.
Yeah. Actively and deliberately. We are looking at a landscape today where nuance is treated as a threat. And we are going to explore this not just through feelings, but through a very specific sociological and historical lens. We're looking at something called the strategy of tension and how it plays out in the architectural reality of cities like Tehran and even in deep political philosophy about the nature of doubt itself.
The strategy of tension. It's a phrase I've heard thrown around, but I really don't think most people realize it's a formal concept. It almost sounds like a conspiracy theory.
It does, but it's actually documented sociological phenomenon. It's history and it is sociology. It refers to a very specific playbook. But before we get lost in the theory and, the Cold War history of it all, I want to ground this. We really need to see what this looks like when it hits a human life.
Okay.
You mentioned a story earlier that really captures the human cost of this dismantled middle ground.
Yes, this is the account of a man named Farhad. And I think it's so important to share this in detail because Farhad isn't a politician. He's not a general. He's a guy who deals with the things we all just take for granted.
Let's hear about Farhad.
Okay, so imagine this man, Farhad, living in Tehran. He's a veteran civil servant. He has spent over 30 years of his life managing a municipal irrigation project. Now, when we think of Iran, we usually think of the Revolutionary Guard or, protesters in the street.
The big, dramatic images.
Exactly. We don't think about the guys who keep the water running. But that was Farhad. He wasn't revolutionary, and he wasn't a hardliner. He was a man of what you'd call the gray zone, he believed in the plumbing of civilization. He saw his job not as an ideological act, but as a necessary function to keep his neighbors alive.
The plumbing of civilization, that is such a vital concept. It's that invisible layer of competence that allows a city to even exist.
It's everything. But as the political climate in Tehran polarized, Farhad found himself squeezed by this strategy of tension. On one side, he had the radical youth and the reformist movements.
Okay.
To them, the very fact that Farhad continued to show up to work, that he continued to cooperate with the state to manage the water grid, that made him a traitor. They saw his labor as propping up the regime.
So in their eyes, he was collaborating with the enemy just by doing his job.
Right. But then you look at the other side. To the state authorities, the hardliners, Farhad was just as suspect because he refused to perform the theatrics of loyalty. He wouldn't sign the extra loyalty oaths. He wouldn't attend the state-sponsored rallies. He just wanted to do his job.
So his lack of enthusiastic shouting marked him as a latent rebel. He was being squeezed from both ends.
Completely. And eventually, the department he managed just collapsed. And it didn't collapse because they ran out of water or pipes or money. It collapsed because nuance was treated as a luxury the city could no longer afford.
The institution itself failed because the people running it were purged for not fitting neatly into a binary box.
And when the pipes finally burst and the neighborhood went dry, it wasn't a resource failure. It was because the institutional intelligence, the 30 years of knowledge Farhad had been bled dry by tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at Farhad's story, it just seems like a textbook case of what the sources call social enemy.
Yes.
When we eliminate political nuance just to win some ideological battle, we accidentally destroy the very institutions that keep the lights on and the water flowing.
Farhad is the canary in the coal mine for that concept, for social enemy. It's a term from sociology that describes the breakdown of social bonds between an individual and their community. It's what happens when the rules of engagement they no longer make sense.
And nothing made sense for him.
Nothing. But the thing that destroyed his department is specifically this strategy of tension. We need to unpack this because it originated thousands of miles away from Tehran in a completely different era, yet the mechanics are identical.
Okay, so let's define it. Strategy of tension. Strategia della tensione. It comes from Italy, right?
It does. It refers to a period in Italian history, roughly from the late 60s through the 80s, often called the Years of Lead. The context here is the Cold War. Italy had the strongest communist party in Western Europe.
And there was a very real possibility they could win a legitimate democratic election and take power.
Which was, of course, a nightmare scenario for NATO and the entire Western establishment.
Absolutely.
So elements within the Italian state, we're talking intelligence agencies, working often with far-right groups and the so-called secret armies like Operation Gladio, they utilized a strategy to manipulate the public. The goal was to stabilize their own power by destabilizing society. They manufactured fear.
And when you say manufactured, we aren't just talking about scary speeches on TV.
No. We are talking about actual violence, bombings, massacres, chaos in the streets. These acts were often carried out by far-right agents, but were deliberately blamed on the left or on anarchists. The idea was to create a climate of such terror and unpredictability that the average citizen, the person just trying to buy bread or go to work, would turn to the state and say, do whatever you have to do, just make it stop.
So you create the disease in order to sell the cure. You invent this monster, the dangerous radical, so you can present yourself as the only protector who can hold back the chaos.
Precisely. And sociologists who study this have identified a circular model to this strategy. It's a cycle. It starts with prevention. You try to stop the opposition legally. When that fails, the state tries to crush dissent.
Okay.
This leads to the isolation of the opposition groups. And when a group is isolated, when it's demonized and ignored, segments of that group may, out of sheer desperation, turn to terrorism or violence.
And once they turn to violence, the trap just slams shut.
Yes, because then the state uses that very violence to justify massive repression. They can say, see, we told you they were terrorists all along. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You treat people like enemies until they become enemies.
And a central part of this whole thing is the idea of the enemy within.
Absolutely. Ruth Wodak, a researcher in this field, she talks about the micropolitics of fear. To make this strategy work, you have to construct a binary of us versus them. The heartland, the good, normal people, must be protected from dangerous outsiders, or even worse, from insiders who don't truly belong.
And that brings it right back to Farhad. He was the ultimate insider. He was the infrastructure. But in a strategy of tension, competence doesn't matter. Only allegiance matters.
Right.
And because he wouldn't wear the team jersey, he became the enemy within to both factions.
And that is the absolute tragedy of social enemy. When a political system becomes obsessed with this friend-enemy distinction, it loses the ability to value anything else. It cannot value expertise, it cannot value history, it can't value the literal plumbing. Farhad's department failed because the system prioritized the appearance of loyalty over the reality of functioning governance.
It's a terrifying thought that if you demand total purity, you literally destroy the machinery of society. The water stops flowing because the one guy who knows how to turn the valve isn't radical enough for one side or loyal enough for the other. But Farhad is just one casualty, right? He was squeezed by domestic politics. There's this whole other layer to this, which is how these conflicts are viewed from the outside. We have another account here from an architecture student named Elam that really exposes the media side of this machine.
Okay, so Elam's perspective shifts us from the internal decay to the external distortion.
It really does. I found this account on a forum where Elam was basically venting about how the West sees her reality. She talks about media reductionism. She says that in London or Washington, her city, Tehran, is depicted in one of two ways. It's either a dark, monolithic fortress of oppression like something out of Mordor,
right,
or it's a romanticized site of constant cinematic rebellion like Les Miserables.
It's the Hollywood lens. It has to be good guys versus bad guys. There's no in-between.
Exactly. But Ellen says there's no room in that news cycle for what she calls the clinical structural reality. She's an architect. She's trying to build sustainable housing. But she's navigating this labyrinth of international sanctions that make concrete triple the price.
Wow.
And at the same time, she's dealing with a local bureaucracy that is far more interested in optics and religious signaling than in actual structural engineering. For Elam, the Western narrative isn't just annoying, it's a profound failure of imagination.
So she's saying that by reducing her entire nation to a simple headline, we miss the actual mechanisms of suffering.
She calls it the geopolitical friction. She lives in that friction. And she argues that by reducing these complex nations to simple binaries, the West actively fails to support the structural changes that would actually lead to stability. We're looking at a high-resolution tragedy through a low-resolution lens.
A high-resolution tragedy through a low-resolution lens. That is a perfect description of what scholars call Orientalism.
Orientalism. I mean, that usually makes me think of, like, 19th century paintings of deserts and harems. How does that apply to Elam trying to buy concrete in 2026?
It applies because Orientalism fundamentally is about reducing the East to a set of fixed, simplistic characteristics that define them as other. And in the modern context, the Atlantic Council points out that Western media views the region almost exclusively through the lens of what they call the unveiling trope.
The obsession with the hijab.
The obsession with the hijab as the sole barometer of freedom. If women are taking off scarves, it's a story about modernity. If they aren't, it's a story about oppression. But Elham's reality is about employment rights, family law, the price of housing, the stability of the currency.
The boring stuff.
The boring stuff that actually defines daily life. When we focus only on the visual symbol of the veil, we ignore all of that. We want the cinematic moment of the scarf burning. We don't want the boring lecture about sanction waivers for construction materials.
This reductionism, it also applies to the political labels we use, right? We're constantly hearing about reformists versus hardliners. But Elam implies that these labels are, for the most part, fake.
They are deeply, deeply misleading. The sources we looked at indicate that the term principalist usul-Garayan is often just lazily translated as hardliner. But inside Iran, that group is fractured into many different camps. And the reformist label is even more deceptive. It creates what's called the reformist myth.
And we see this right now with the current president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The Western press, they immediately slapped the reformist label on him when he was elected.
Of course they did. Because the narrative needs a hero, it needs a good guy. But if you actually look at the facts on the ground, Pezeshkian is a loyalist to the supreme leader. He has a history of enforcing hijab rules in hospitals and universities before they were even mandatory laws.
Wait, let's just pause on that for a second. The reformist hope of the West was voluntarily enforcing the dress code before the state even required it.
Yes. But because he isn't the most extreme option available, he gets labeled moderate. And this is so dangerous because it creates an illusion of democracy. It implies that the Iranian people have a meaningful choice between two different visions of the future.
When in reality,
they are often choosing between two different managers of the same status quo.
So this puts someone like Elam in what you'd call a double bind.
Exactly. The double bind theory explains how individuals or even whole nations get trapped in these feedback loops. The West sanctions the country to hurt the regime. This triples the price of concrete for Elam and completely destroys the middle class. The regime then uses the sanctions to blame the West for all the misery, which validates their anti-Western propaganda, and they crack down on dissent to maintain control.
And she's squeezed from the outside by sanctions and from the inside by repression.
She's completely trapped, and her plea for structural analysis is basically a plea for us to stop looking at the symbols and start looking at the mechanics, because the symbols lie, but the price of concrete doesn't.
It also highlights that this strategy of tension isn't just a domestic thing, it's global. We create these symplectic enemies, the axis of evil, the great Satan, to justify foreign policy. And in doing that, we blind ourselves to the reality on the ground. We can't help Elam because we can't even see her. We only see the caricature we've created.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the institutional cost with Farhad. We've talked about the media distortion with Elam. But there's a third story here that I think is maybe the most personal. It's about the psychological toll. The toll of just trying to think for yourself in a world that demands you pick a side. This is the story of Arash.
Okay, so now we're looking at the internal landscape.
Exactly. Arash is a young professional. He lives in a social circle where taking a side is the only currency of belonging. During a period of intense civil unrest, Arash found himself completely unable to join the chorus of either extreme. He supported the call for reform, he wanted change, but he found what he called the culture of narcissism within the protest leadership to be deeply unsettling.
That's a very specific critique, the culture of narcissism.
It is. He saw influencers who seemed more concerned with their digital brand than with the safety of the people in the street. He saw the movement becoming a backdrop for selfies. So he chose intellectual independence. He refused to parrot slogans he didn't believe in just to fit in.
And what was the result of that?
Well, the result was that he was canceled by his friends for being insufficiently radical, and at the same time investigated by his employers for being insufficiently loyal.
So he became the enemy of everyone.
Of everyone.
Yeah.
He described it as a psychological burden. So heavy, it felt like physical exhaustion. He was a man of merit in a world that only valued tribal loyalty. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about Arash because it is so easy to judge him. It's easy to say, why didn't he just join the movement? But the emotional regulation required to stay rational when everyone around you is screaming for blood, it's Herculean.
It is.
And while some might see his neutrality as a lack of courage, I see it as the ultimate form of bravery. We live in an era where tribalism is the path of least resistance. To stand in the middle, maintaining meritocratic values against a tide of collective ego, is a profoundly lonely act.
Arash's experience is a perfect illustration of what the sociologist Christopher Lasch called the culture of narcissism. Now, when Lasch uses that word, he doesn't just mean vanity. He doesn't mean people looking in the mirror all day.
Right, it's not just about being self-absorbed in that simple way.
No, not at all. Lasch defined pathological narcissism as a heightened version of normality in a dying culture. In a world where the past feels irrelevant and the future feels terrifying, people lose their sense of historical continuity. They retreat into the self. And politics ceases to be about common life, about fixing the pipes like Farhad's, and becomes a form of self-expression. It becomes a spectacle.
So for the influencers Arash was critiquing, the protest wasn't really about the outcome for the country. It was about their identity as a protester. It was about them.
Precisely. It becomes about the brand. And Lasch also talks about the revolt of the elites. He argued that the new elites have withdrawn from the common obligations of citizenship. They live in voluntary ghettos, either physical gated communities or, more often now, ideological bubbles online. They detach themselves from the messy reality of the middle, and this detachment is what fuels the tribalism that Arash experienced. If you aren't signaling the exact right virtues of the tribe, you are cast out.
Which explains the cancellation. It's a mechanism of enforcing the bubble. But Arash's resistance, his refusal to join in, that really reminds me of Tocqueville.
Alexis de Tocqueville, yes. He wrote about the tyranny of the majority in democracies. He had this fascinating insight that the pressure to conform in a democracy is actually stronger than in a dictatorship.
How so?
Well, in a dictatorship, you fear the king. In a democracy, you fear your neighbor, you fear the crowd. And to stand against the crowd requires what he called audacious doubt.
Audacious doubt. I love that phrase. We usually think of doubt as a weakness.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I'm not sure. But he's framing it as an active, aggressive virtue.
It is active because it's painful. Tocqueville recognized that humans crave certainty. Certainty is comfortable. Doubt is anxiety. But he argued that doubt is the precursor to conversation. If you are certain, you don't need to talk to anyone. You just need to defeat them. If you doubt, you have to engage. Arash, by maintaining his doubt about both the state's propaganda and the influencer's narcissism, was preserving the only space where democratic thought can actually exist.
But look at the cost. He talks about physical exhaustion. It literally wears you down.
It does. Because in a culture of narcissism, neutrality is framed as cowardice. You hear it all the time. Silence is violence, right? But what Arash shows us is that refusing to flatten your identity is actually a test of character. It is the struggle to maintain reality, the gray, messy, complex reality, when the world is demanding a black and white cartoon.
So, we've painted a pretty terrifying picture here. We have a strategy of tension-breaking institutions like the water department. We have media narratives erasing complexity and erasing people like Elam. We have a culture of narcissism punishing independent thinkers like Arash. But the question that keeps nagging me is, why is this happening everywhere? This isn't just an Iranian story. I feel this in the US, in Europe. It feels like the operating system of the modern world.
It feels that way because the drivers are systemic and they are global. If we zoom out, we can see the roots of this in the war on terror.
Okay, so that takes us back to the early 2000s.
The 21st century began with a very, very binary declaration. You are either with us or you are with the terrorists. That single moment, which we see analyzed in the critical criminology sources, effectively replaced the old Cold War binary of capitalism versus communism with a new clash of civilizations. It created a global framework where nuance was dangerous. If you questioned the strategy, you were sympathizing with the enemy.
So it set the template. It taught us that the only way to be safe is to be 100% on one side. And that logic then trickled down from foreign policy into everything else.
It legitimized the labeling of any dissenters as extremists. Whether they are environmentalists or Muslims or just critics of a certain policy, the US versus them framework became the default setting for governance.
But in the West, specifically in democracies, there's also a mathematical component to this polarization. It's not just culture, it's the actual mechanics of how we vote. We have data from places like Represent Us that shows how our systems are practically designed to destroy the middle ground.
And this is the clinical structural analysis that Elam was talking about, but we need to apply it to ourselves. Just look at gerrymandering. We all know the term, but think about the incentive structure it creates.
Gerrymandering is redrawing the district lines to basically guarantee a win for a specific party.
Right. It creates safe districts. If a district is drawn so that it is 80% Party A, the general election doesn't matter. Party A is going to win. The only election that matters is the primary. And who votes in primaries?
The most motivated, the most ideological, often the most extreme base of the party.
Exactly. So if you are a moderate politician, if you are a Farhad type who wants to compromise and keep the water running, you are going to lose the primary to someone who is screaming louder.
You get primaried out. The system actively punishes compromise. If you reach across the aisle, you lose your job. So the middle ground in the legislature just evaporates.
And then you have the first past the post system on top of that, which forces two-party dominance.
Which is the mathematics of the spoiler effect. If you vote for a third party, a nuanced party, you might split the vote and accidentally help the candidate you hate the most win. This forces strategic voting.
It does.
And that explains the feeling so many of us have of voting against someone rather than for someone.
It is the exact same dynamic we saw in Iran with the reformist versus hardliner trap. You vote for the reformist not because he represents you, but because you are terrified of the alternative. The system eliminates the option for a genuine middle ground. It forces you into a binary choice, even if both options are bad.
So we're stuck in a machine, both culturally and mathematically, that turns nuance into wasted votes and treats doubt as treason. I mean, it feels bleak, but our sources do point to a solution space. If the system is designed this way, how do we fix it?
Well, if the problem is structural, the solution has to be structural. Represent Us points to things like independent redistricting commissions. Take the map-making power away from the politicians themselves. Make the districts competitive again. Because if a politician has to win a truly competitive district, they have to talk to the middle. They have to listen to the Farhads and the Arashes of the world.
And they also mentioned ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice voting is crucial because it allows nuance to be expressed mathematically. You can rank your favorite candidate first, even if they are a third party, without fearing you are throwing your vote away. If your first choice loses, your vote just moves to your second choice. It breaks the binary. It allows for a multicolored political spectrum instead of just red versus blue.
But there's also an intellectual reform needed too, right? I mean, we can't just change the voting machines. We have to change our minds.
We have to return to Tocqueville. We have to reclaim doubt as a civic virtue. We have to actively resist the micropolitics of fear. When that woman at the dinner party asks, whose side are you on? The answer has to be a rejection of the premise itself.
It's refusing to accept the menu of options that's been provided by the strategy of tension.
Precisely. It is realizing that the strategy of tension profits from compressing complexity. When we refuse to be compressed, we break the strategy.
I want to try and bring this all back home. We've traveled from the irrigation tunnels of Tehran with Farhad, through the architectural drawings of Elam, to the social isolation of Arash.
And what unites all of them is the cost they paid. Farhad paid with his career because the institution couldn't value his quiet competence. Elam pays with her visibility because the media can't see her complexity. And Arash paid with his social circle because the culture couldn't tolerate his independence.
They are the casualties of a world that has declared war on the gray zone. But in a way, they are also our guides. They show us what is at stake.
They remind us that the system wants us to be tribal. It is easier to govern, easier to sell ads to, and easier to mobilize a population that sees the world in black and white.
So the realization here, for me, is that remaining discerning is not sitting on the fence. I think that's the biggest lie we've been told, that if you don't pick a side, you're doing nothing. But as we've seen today, staying in the middle is active work. It is a deliberate, difficult act of care.
It is the plumbing of civilization, to go back to Farhad. It's the unglamorous work of keeping the water running while everyone else is fighting over the flag.
I want to leave you with this thought. We often talk about protecting democracy or protecting borders or protecting free speech. But listening to these stories, it strikes me that the hardest thing to protect in a polarized world is the integrity of your own mind. The pressure to conform, to fear the other, to flatten your own complicated history into a team jersey, it is overwhelming. But if we can resist that, if we can hold on to our audacious doubt, we preserve the only space where real solutions and real humanity can actually survive.
And that is the ultimate resistance.
Thank you for diving deep with us today.
It was a pleasure.